Hello everybody, we're continuing our discussion of moral theories, and today we're going to talk about moral theories of duty, or duty ethics. And the most famous duty ethicist, Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher from the 18th century, that's the 1700s. He had a lot to say about moral duties and deciding on what is morally correct. Two big ideas that Kant puts forward, although he puts forward a lot, so buckle up. First, through reason, through our rational mind, we can find the moral laws. These absolute, objective, moral laws and truths that we have to follow. Once we find those moral rights, those moral duties, those moral laws, we have to follow them, and we have to follow them with the intention of following them. Doing duty because it is the right thing. You have to do the right thing with intention. Notice this is very different from the consequentialists, who did not place much value on intention. They said we measure the rightness of an action by the outcome. And this is different than the contractarians, who also don't usually measure an action by intent. They measure it by legality, right? So this is quite a different look at ethics than we've seen before. So Kant puts forth these imperatives. He says there are hypothetical imperatives, which are not necessarily morally bound. So, for example, if you want something, you need to do this thing. If you want money, you need to work. That's a hypothetical imperative. Kant does not really say that these are important morally. The moral imperatives he refers to as categorical imperatives. Now, a little issue with Kant's writing, in my humble opinion, is that he uses this phrase categorical imperative to describe a few different things. So, well, let's talk about that. Categorical imperatives, he says these are things that you have to do in every situation. So, what are these rules of categorical imperatives? First, you can only do something if it's acceptable for everyone to do it all the time. You can't set yourself apart from morality, right? Or apart from, I can't be this unique person with a special bias just for my actions. I have to say, would it be okay if everybody did it? If the answer is no, that is an immoral thing. So again, this idea of using reason to find absolute moral truths, he says, the first way you can do that, would it be acceptable if everybody did it? If no, I've used reason to find this moral truth. And once I have that moral rule, I have to follow it. Kant is an absolutist. Meaning, would it be acceptable for me to murder somebody? Well, we would say, no, that's not something that everybody can do. And that means there is no moral exception for murder. We'll dive a little deeper into that in a second. Another of his categorical imperatives, we need to treat people as an end, not just as a means to an end. Recall back, very early in this lecture series, to the idea of extrinsic versus intrinsic value. We don't treat people like gas that has value as a means to going somewhere. We treat people like, well, not like a painting, but to walk with the analogy for a second, the painting has inherent value. The human life has inherent value. We don't just treat these things as means to end. We treat them as valuable in and of themselves. Two very important ideas here from Kant. Kant introduces perfect and imperfect duties. You should always do your duty, but some you absolutely have to do without fail. Those are the perfect duties. One of the more controversial perfect duties that Kant puts forward is do not lie. So, categorical imperative says we can only do something if it's okay for everybody to do it. Can I lie if it's not okay for someone else to lie? If everybody lied all the time, our society would crumble. It's not morally acceptable to lie. Therefore, there is never a situation in which I can morally lie. I can't do it. Perhaps that's true. Maybe there is never any situation where lying is acceptable. I think maybe some of us would say there are situations where lying is acceptable. A controversial one, maybe you should lie to further your causes. You know, you really believe that this cause is right. It's okay for me to lie in service of this cause that I support. Maybe that's not a more common example. Maybe it's okay to lie to a child to protect them from some hard truth. Starting to see some of these, a little tricky. But Kant says, once we've found these moral duties, these perfect moral duties, you must always follow. He says we also have imperfect duties. Help those in need. You should do it. Do it as often as you can. But you can't, to kind of hop back to that utilitarian problem of the no rest problem, you can't be morally obligated to literally always do the right thing, to always help those in poor, help those who are poor, help those in need. Obviously, if you're doing it all the time, you're not going to have any time to take care of yourself. So Kant is an absolutist. No exceptions to his perfect duties. There are some times you don't have to, there are exceptions for those imperfect duties. So let's think about Kantian ethics. Are there moral absolutes? Do you believe that there are things that are always wrong? Things that are always unacceptable, morally unacceptable things to do? Kant says lying, maybe more egregious things, murder, the killing of innocents. Had a student say in class one time, what about rape? It's hard to mention such a horrific thing. Is there ever a moral situation where that's acceptable? I imagine a lot of you guys, no, obviously not. That's never going to be a morally acceptable thing to do. Well, if there are moral absolutes, and we've just thought about it, there's never a situation where these things are morally acceptable. Maybe Kant has something to say here. Maybe we need our moral philosophy to take into account the fact that there are things that are objectively morally wrong regardless of the situation. Maybe we need just a splash of absolutism in our philosophy if we believe that there are things that are always wrong. Does Kantian ethics help us solve problems? Well, that categorical imperative is pretty powerful. Maybe that has a lot to say. Treat people as valuable in and of themselves. That's a good rule. I should always follow that. I don't treat people as means to an end. I treat them as an end in themselves, valuable in their unique human life. And also, I can't do things that I wouldn't want other people doing all the time. Those are pretty helpful rules to follow. Maybe it would help us solve some moral questions. Maybe Kant's got a lot to say here. Does definitely do some great stuff. Kant's philosophy gives us a universal framework. Rules apply impartially to everybody. These first 2 points, everybody follows the same categorical imperatives, and you don't get to make yourself the special exception. Well, it would be bad for everybody else to do it, but for me, no, there's none of that. And also we put this emphasis on respecting individual human value. We might agree, those are pretty good things to have up here as important moral ideas to keep in our back pocket. Another duty-based moral theory, the natural law theory, also called the natural law tradition. Natural law has been around a very long time. As early as ancient Greece and Rome, philosophers have been writing about these ideas. The most recent well, certainly not the most recent, but a recent, very famous philosopher to speak on this was St. Thomas Aquinas. What is the basic idea of natural law? You do the things that go along with our innate natural order, things that are natural to human beings. So again, this idea, we're going to use reason to consider, now instead of categorical imperatives, instead of doing that, we're going to use reason to consider what it is about humans that makes us humans, and try and decipher these natural laws, and then we need to follow them. We're morally obligated to follow them. So Aquinas says these are the sorts of things that humans have to do. Innate to human nature is the preservation of human life. Don't hurt yourself. You ought to reproduce, take care of your young. I imagine all these first three should be very obvious based on our, innate biological drives. A little trickier, you should search for truth. You have a moral obligation to search for truth. It certainly does seem to be part of the human experience. Oh my goodness, is that what we're doing now? Are we searching for truth in this very class? I hope so. So maybe that is part of the human moral experience as well, that we ought to pursue truth. We should take care of each other, pursue our social ties, try and make our commitments to one another stronger, and just be nice to people, be benign, be fair with people, be reasonable. All of these perhaps are in our nature, and if we use reason to try and carve out things about human nature that are duties we ought to follow, maybe they show up here. So, again, a very duty-based philosophy. We want to follow the moral duties that are within our human nature. We're going to use reason to discern these natural laws, and then once we have them, we need to follow them. And again, we're using reason to describe our innate natural order, and we want to follow those moral duties that we create. Lot in common with Kant here. Much like Kant, this is an objective and universal philosophy. Everybody's got to use reason to find these natural laws and then follow them. And like Kant, it's absolutist. We have to follow it all the time. There's no exceptions to these natural laws. Is it consistent with moral judgments? Well, as I pointed out, this radical absolutism, the same kind of thing we've talked about with Kant, maybe there are times when lying is morally permissible. Maybe there are times when murder is morally permissible. I don't know. Gets a little hairier. Obviously. Usefulness in moral problem solving? It might be hard to divvy up what's in nature from what's ought to be, or what's moral. Maybe an example of this would be the vegetarianism question. Is it morally right to eat meat, to eat other animals? Well, humans certainly can only eat vegetables. Humans also can only eat meat. Well, what's the natural law guide? So we might say, well, we've got eyes forward, like predators. We've got canine teeth. Maybe just by reasoning about our human nature, we could say, yeah, eating meat's morally acceptable. But is that an ought to be just because we have these features? Is that the morally right thing? Can reason always show us these natural laws? Might be a little tricky to find these out. big idea here. Intent matters. Intent matters. You got to do the right thing because it's the right thing. Very different from consequentialist moral theories. Both of these duty ethics philosophies are going to introduce us to the idea of intent being important to ethics. Got an example here, burglar in a window. We'll come back to that one a little later.